Good morning, and thank you for joining us. I hope you all are having a good time at Policy Orientation Day 2. Woo-woo! My name is Andrew Brown. I have the privilege of serving as the Director for the Center for Families and Children at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Last March, my wife and I welcomed our first child. Leading up to our son's birth, we benefited from a community of friends and family who shared advice from their experience as parents. The one thing we heard time and time again was how parenthood is completely life-changing. It was easy to understand that intellectually, but it didn't hit home until the moment that I held Boyd in my arms. And it was at that time that I realized that my friends and my family hadn't told me the whole truth. Being a father wasn't just life-changing, it was world-changing. I'm actually obsessed with becoming a good father. I'm devouring books on the subject like a true researcher should. And at Christmas, I was given a book called The Good Neighbor, about the life of the legendary children's television host, Mr. Rogers. Fred Rogers possessed an unrivaled depth of wisdom on the topic of raising children and the importance of strong communities. One thing he said that I think is particularly applicable to the conversation we'll be having today is this: we live in a world in which we need to share responsibility. It's easy to say, it's not my problem, not my community, not my world, not my child. Then there are those who see the need and respond. I consider those people my heroes. This is a profound statement of two key values that we share: personal responsibility and service to our neighbor. Too often, our society looks to others, particularly to government, to solve the big problems we face. And this is especially true of the problem of child abuse. It's too messy, too scary. So we abdicate our responsibility as friends, family members, and neighbors to a distant bureaucracy. Mr. Rogers challenges us to do the opposite. Rather than waiting for someone else to help when there's a problem, he challenges each of us to step up and to take on that responsibility. Last session, the 85th Legislature took the revolutionary step of returning control of the state's broken child welfare system to the local communities. Senate Bill 11 transformed the way Texas approaches child welfare by getting government out of the way and increasing the role of local communities and nonprofit organizations in serving families and caring for children. Absolutely. Under the new community-based care model, networks of community organizations located in several regions called catchment areas take primary responsibility for foster care placement and case management services under a contract with the Department of Family and Protective Services. Implementation began in Region 3B, a 7-county region that includes Tarrant County, under the leadership of Our Community, Our Kids. In December, 2Engage launched CBC in Region 2, a 30-county area that includes Abilene and Wichita Falls. And next month, CBC will come to Bexar County through the Children's Shelter. As community-based care continues to roll out across the state, we'll be taking a look at the progress that has already been made since Senate Bill 11 became law and the work that needs to be done to ensure the success of this innovative model. I'm honored to be joined today by an impressive panel of experts, each of whom has been actively involved in the creation and implementation of community-based care. Representative James Frank is in his 4th term, representing House District 69, which includes his hometown of Wichita Falls. We don't have committee assignments just yet, but during the last legislative session, he was the vice chair of the House Human Services Committee and a member of the Natural Resources and Local and Consent Calendars Committee. He was the House sponsor of Senate Bill 11 and was instrumental in the creation of the community-based care model. A businessman, Representative Frank owns 2 manufacturing companies employing over 100 Texans. He and his wife of 28 years, Alicia, have 6 sons and are active members of First Baptist Church of Wichita Falls. Annette Rodriguez, in the orange jacket, is the president and CEO of the Children's Shelter, which is the lead agency bringing community-based care to Bexar County. Under her leadership, the Children's Shelter is a nationally recognized nonprofit providing a safe haven for child survivors of abuse, neglect, and abandonment in San Antonio and Bexar County. A native of San Antonio, Annette graduated from Our Lady of the Lake University, where she received her Bachelor of Arts in English and Masters of Science in School Psychology. She also holds an Executive MBA from the University of Texas at San Antonio. She currently sits on the boards of the Nonprofit Council, Masters Leadership San Antonio, the Texas Alliance for Children and Families, and the Alliance for Strong Families and Children. Katie Ols is the CEO of the Texas Alliance of Child and Family Services. Before joining TACFS, she served as the Deputy Commissioner for DFPS and as Chief of Staff for the Health and Human Services Commission. Katie holds a bachelor's degree from Indiana University and has completed graduate studies at the Indiana University School of Public and Environmental Affairs. Will Francis is a licensed master social worker and the Government Relations Director for the National Association of Social Workers, Texas chapter. Prior to joining NASW, he worked for Mental Health America of Texas in the state office of a home visiting program and held positions with Child Protective Services and Travis County Juvenile Probation. Will received his master's degree in social work from the University of Texas at Austin and his bachelor's degree in English from Hampton-Sydney College in Virginia. In 2018, he was honored with the NASW Gilman Wells Award for his advocacy on behalf of Texas social workers. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. I'd like to start our conversation with Representative Frank. You played a key role in the legislative efforts during the 85th session to transform the way Texas cares for vulnerable children. Could you give us just a little bit of background on what transpired that session and your perspective on the current state of implementation?
Sure. I'd be happy to. If I can, let me just say one thing real quick on TPPF. You can't stop me because I got the mic. No, but I appreciate TPPF getting involved in this and obviously starting the center with Brandon and now you. I think too long conservatives have sat on the sidelines and just say we have too many government programs, and as opposed to actually coming up with solutions in those. And so whether it's the thinkers or the donors or that kind of stuff, we have to engage in these issues. We can't just act like they're not there. And so, last session, which is what you asked about. The main thing we did, obviously, we basically we did some appropriations things. We paid about $1,000 more for the employees to make sure that we had the very best and brightest folks working on this. We did HB 5, which is to make it a standalone agency. Did some things to make it easier for CPS to make decisions, much more streamlined decisions. These are very difficult areas that we're working in, and making them part of a larger bureaucracy is not a way to make it easier to get those decisions made. And then the last but not least, and there were some other things as well, but the biggest thing was the community-based care, which is SB 11 that you talked about. And that is to make it more community-focused, to basically break up the state of Texas and its 28 million people in 254 counties and 5 million kids and 60,000 kids involved in foster care into smaller elements where both from an accountability will be more local, the services that are provided to kids will be more local. And so that really is the biggest thing. The challenge with it is it's not a magic pill because it takes a while to implement. It's a big state, and if anything, I have in the frustration, which is probably the next question, the implementation has taken a long time. We had the 7 counties around Fort Worth that have been out there for a while, and we have just now, after almost 2 years, have implemented in Wichita Falls and Abilene, the 30 counties there. And then it's just about to start in San Antonio, but we are just now starting to see the fruits as we go into this next session. So it's still very much a work in process.
You mentioned a little bit of frustration with the pace of implementation. What role, if any, do you see the legislature taking during the 86th session on implementing community-based care?
Well, I'm frustrated, but also it needs to be done right? Ready, fire, aim is not a good way to do this. We need to make sure it's done right. And so at this point, it's like at least three of the regions are catchment areas, but regions are in place. 2 others are coming soon. And so now I think it's a matter of being patient and also making sure that the kids are being served better in those areas.
Annette, you're one of the lead organizations. You're scheduled to take over Region 8A on February 1st, less than a month away.
No pressure.
No pressure at all.
No one's counting.
No one's watching. Don't worry.
Where are you all right now? Give us a brief update on your progress.
We, as I've mentioned to my community, when I have colleagues that come up to me and they say, "How are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm like the duck. Above the surface, I look calm and cool, but underneath the water, we are just paddling like heck." So we executed our contract on August 1st, and the last 6 months, which is the startup period, has been just filled with lots of activities to get us ready to February 1st. And so we have had to staff up. We've had to go out and recruit and find the right people for the positions that we're looking for. So when all is said and done, we will have had to hire over 71 new positions for this contract, and we are on target to make sure that we're there. We actually have the last batch coming through what we call our new employee orientation next week. So we will be fully staffed by the time we go live. In addition to that, one of the things that was really exciting during the startup period was coming together with our regional DFPS office and also with state office. And we had sessions called protocol sessions. And in these protocol sessions, you really start to create what community-based care will look like in your communities. So you have DFPS who will share with the SSCC staff what their current practices are. They share where their pain points are. They share where the good stuff is going and what they think should definitely stay in the system. And as we had those protocol meetings, something really wonderful happened. We were able to identify a gap right away so that I can confidently say that on day one, when we go live on February 1st, we would have already made improvements to the foster care system in Bexar County. And one of those system changes is the intake of children. So as we sat down with DFPS workers, investigators, the investigation unit, they said, we have to go out, and when we have to remove children from their homes. It's usually a very chaotic situation, a very stressful and emotionally charged situation. They have to bring the children back with them. They usually have 2-3 children in the backseat of their cars, and that child is not recognized in the foster care system until they are entered into the state database, which means then placement can't take place until that system or that child is in the system. So one of two things has to happen. That CPS worker has to either pull over somewhere in a parking lot, maybe grab some food for the children if they're hungry, and start entering data into the system. And all that while, there's a lot of anxiety in the back seat, especially if the children are old enough to understand what just happened. Or the CPS worker has to drive back to DFPS offices and again enter information into the system and have children in tow, again, with high levels of anxiety and having to calm them down and de-escalate, which just prolongs the intake process. And also, as the DFPS worker shared with us, really hinders their ability to gather the data that they need to put into the system so that the best matches can take place. So we just felt like that was a huge gap that we could certainly step in right away and rectify. So on day one, we will have an intake center. We will have an intake center where Family Tapestry staff, which is the SSCC's name, and investigation staff will come together. So a DFPS investigator will go and pick up the child. They'll remove the child. They will come to our intake center. We will have trained child care providers on site who can then bathe the child if they need a bath, feed the children. We'll have a trauma-informed, child-friendly environment so children can play and be children and get the services that they need. We will have Krista Santa Rosa, our local children's hospital, on site who will be able to do a quick assessment if we need them to receive that. All the while, our caseworker, our CPS caseworker, is able to take the time that they need to put the information into the system. And that's the beauty of community-based work, when DFPS and the SSCC can come together, identify a gap, and then together also create a solution. So we're really excited about that. Lots of other great stuff going on. We're contracting with the network. We will have to contract with over 100 providers. Bexar County, on average, has about 2,000 children in paid foster care on any given day, and 30% of those children are placed outside of the region. So we are crazily going out and reaching out to lots of providers all over the state that currently have Bexar County children and contracting. But we're very confident that we're on track and that we are ready to go on February 1st.
And that's one of the amazing things, that all of this innovation has happened before you've even taken over. And Katie, we were talking before Christmas that you're seeing that as someone who works directly with frontline providers all over the state, that in regions where DFPS hasn't even announced the request for proposal yet, you're already seeing the communities innovating to get ready.
That's right.
Could you talk a little bit about some of those improvements and innovations that you're seeing?
Absolutely. And I just also want to thank you and TPPF for having this panel today. There are days where I wonder why I picked child welfare instead of oil and gas. And it is, as you said this morning, Representative Frank, it is humbling to work in child welfare, but also fulfilling. And it's great to have the support of other leaders, such as TPPF, to help us carry this torch forward. So thank you for highlighting this issue today. The best, there's 17 catchment areas in the state. There are 3 currently under contract. There are 2 currently operational, and of those 2 catchment areas, 1 has been operational for about a month and a half. Is that right, Brandon? So we really have excellent data on 1 catchment area, and that data across the board is showing great results. Kids are closer to home, they're placed with their siblings, they're getting less restrictive, which is a child welfare term, but they're in a home-like setting when they can be and their needs can be met. Something I like to think about when I think about foster care is it's not just about that bed or that placement. Foster care services are wraparound services for that child and that family. And so it's so much more than just a placement or a bed. So the data is looking really good. The data is showing that we are making great progress and yielding the results that I think the legislature hoped. But what I think is even cooler, or as cool, is the momentum that we now have in communities around the state. The legislature set a course. They directed this implementation, and communities are now responding. It has been 10 years, at least, maybe more. The pace has been slow, but I think what I'm finally at peace with the pace is that I think we had to go slow to go fast. We had to have the starts and stops. We had to have the lessons learned. We had to have, it is an entirely new and different model for serving our children and families, new funding structures, new contracts, new accountability. It's performance-based, which the state had not done before. So I think I'm finally at peace with that, and my hope is now that we've figured a lot of this out, and communities are now, they're energized and they're coming together and they're saying, bring us our data. We want to know what we're good at. We want to know what our deficiencies are. They're bringing leaders together that maybe were unlikely partners before. You've got school districts and law enforcement and hospitals and mental health authorities coming to the table to saying, what's our role? Tell us what you need, and let's create a system here that serves our children and our families. So I think that's almost as exciting as the great numbers that we're seeing coming.
Absolutely. And you mentioned Brandon Logan. I want to recognize him. Brandon Logan was my predecessor in this role. He departed TPPF to take the lead of To Engage, which is implementing CBC in Abilene. And he was telling us this morning that they've been open for a month and a half and already have a 100% success rate in keeping sibling groups together, which is very impressive. Well done, sir. Will, I'd like to come down to you with a similar question. How are the social workers that you represent responding to community-based care and preparing for implementation?
We really, as an association, took a look at community care and responded, I think, with a little bit of skepticism. And some of that was, are we really able to transform child welfare through this model, or are we simply picking up the bad outcomes that the state has and moving them into the community? And we really wanted to make sure that the community was getting all the resources that they needed to really be successful for kids. And part of my initial sort of response was, have we given the state the full opportunity to do what they need to do? We just gave them the raise for the caseworkers to work on retention and actually keeping the workforce around to work with the kids. Have we really funded the services we need for the parents and the families and to make sure that the court systems are really working well with what's there in the communities? Or are we simply saying, you know what, the state doesn't work, let's move into the private realm? And that was sort of my initial response, was we really need to watch this and make certain that we're actually doing what is in the best interest of kids in a fashion that really is going to get them to success. And I'll be 100% honest, through this process, I've moved more and more to understanding that community care really, really does have some deep benefits that the state may or may not have actually had. The previous commissioner before Commissioner Whitman, Commissioner Specia, as he was leaving, sat down with a group of us, and as he was talking, he said, there's not one school district in the state of Texas. There are many, many school districts, and they serve each area well because of how they can individualize services to kids. And that's a model that I think makes some sense when you overlay it with the child welfare. Things in the valley look very different from things in the panhandle. And so social workers, I think, are coming along more cautiously to understanding, okay, communities, if given the resources that they need, maybe really can serve in the best interests of their kids. I think one of the frameworks that is important to think about is CPS is in many ways a traumatized system. It is hammered by the public. It is hammered by advocates. It is hammered by the legislature. It is often gets hammered. You very rarely see positive CPS stories in the media. And when you think of a traumatized child, they're not really able to grow and thrive and expand and sort of do all the things they need to do. And I think one of the things I'm seeing with community care is we're actually maybe resetting that and allowing our communities to step back from sort of getting all that negative attention or that overwhelming trauma that we're putting on them, and allowing those individual regions to sort of develop and grow at paces that they need to and in ways that are best for their individual communities. And so that to me is a very positive aspect to it, and it really makes me feel more optimistic about the way we're going and maybe less of my concern around the edges, although I still think, as has been said, we need to make sure we're doing this in a deliberate way and we're doing it in a way that's best for our state and for our kids.
So I'd like to stay with you on that topic of the challenges and opportunities. We've discussed the benefits, but Will, from your perspective, what are some of the challenges and opportunities that are facing successful implementation?
I think Representative Frank, who has been an amazing champion and leader in this area, along with his colleagues in the Senate and the House, has really talked about accountability and innovation, and that's what can really happen, and that we can actually keep our single source continuum contractors accountable, and I think that's important. I will give DFPS 100% of the credit here. They have hit 3 for 3 in selecting single source continuum contractors. They have selected agencies and organizations and executive directors and heads who understand their communities, who have a deep connection to child welfare, and who want to do what's both best for the kids and what's best for their areas. Will that continue? That's one of the areas that we need to make sure that we are still selecting single source continuum contractors that are in this for the right reasons, which is to make Texas kids' lives better, not for anything else. Additionally, each community is only strong as the community resources which are there. So if we go to areas and we don't have enough behavioral health services, if we don't have enough substance abuse treatment or mental health services or capacity for foster kids and treatment foster care or a deep understanding of what trauma-informed care is, then our communities are going to need more resources. And our urban areas are going to have access to a lot more private dollars than some of our rural areas are. That's just sort of the way the state is set up. So I think we need to be very careful in that we're not leaving any of our areas sort of out to dry. So one of the pieces of that is each region really has to build upon the strengths of the region before it. And I think Annette's going to talk a little bit about how some of the single source continuum contractors are already working together and already building bridges among each other. And that to me is so vital. I think one of the challenges is if we have a whole bunch of islands versus if we have a whole bunch of connected areas with bridges and transfer of information and resources. One of my biggest concerns about DFPS is that they often, from my perspective, don't necessarily focus on the difference between outputs and outcomes. Outputs simply being numbers, outputs meaning what do those numbers actually turn into in the lives of kids. And I think our contractors and our single source continuum contractors are really taking that extra step towards outcomes. And I think that is largely based on the way the legislature has said, you better get this right, and if you don't, we're going to be there to watch you.
Annette, how are the SSCCs coordinating with one another currently and then helping ones that want to come on board?
Well, one of the things that's been exciting now that we've got 3 coming together, we heard very loud and clear from the different providers across the state that there are some providers, there may be many providers that have to contract with multiple SSCCs because some of the services that they provide are so niched. And so, in doing so, that means that they're going to be monitored by the state by licensing, but then as our contractual requirement as a SSCC, if we contract with the provider, there's also monitoring that we have to do of that provider. So if we have a provider out there who has contracted with all 3 SSCCs because of their niche services, they could be monitored 3 times by 3 different SSCCs and then also the state, which now you're spending a lot of resources and time if you're that provider on monitoring versus on the quality of care that you want for children. So we have come together and we've started the dialogue of what it might look like if we can jointly and partner somehow so that there isn't this huge oversight of monitoring on our partners. We definitely want to make sure that the right level of monitoring is taking place and that the quality quality of care is there for our children, but we don't want to be redundant and waste resources in that way. And so we are having those discussions. In addition to that, we also have, in the very short time that the three of us have been in operation, have been able to put together and invest some dollars in creating what we're calling the Texas Gateway, which is the database system. So providers will be able to enter into the database system, which will give us SSCCs the opportunity to look at data. Our data won't be shared, so every SSCC will only have access to the data from their catchment area, but we'll be able to run reports that will be able to show us how each of us is doing, and if there's a strength in one particular area, then the other two can learn from that. In addition to that, it also reduces redundancy, because again, if we had 3 SSCCs with 3 different databases, now you have those same providers who have the 3 different contracts having to enter their data and train their staff on 3 different databases and potentially having to purchase 3 different databases. We've made the investment. We took our private dollars as the 3 SSCCs, made the investment in creating this system, and it is not costing our providers a penny, and that was our commitment to our providers and to our agencies, and so we're excited about that. And I believe, Brandon, you guys went live with it in December, and I think it's working wonderfully.
What is SS?
Single source continuum contractor. It's the term of art for the private nonprofit organizations that are running community-based. We like to talk in acronyms.
Department of Family and Protective Services. I'm sorry, we love our acronyms.
We do. And we'll have question and answer at the end of the...
Yeah.
And we will have question and answer time at the end of the panel. Absolutely. Yeah. I want to open up this question to the entire panel about what are the challenges, what are the opportunities that we're facing to make sure that community-based care is successful, and anybody who wants to jump in.
I'll jump in. I think the 3 things I worry about is implementation, implementation, and implementation. It's a very difficult thing. CPS has not been set up to do this in the past, and they are really they have to change who they are as it relates to foster care. They are no longer the direct service provider. They are monitoring it, and if they try to run it too much like a government program, they're going to choke the innovation that will come. But at the same, and so that concerns me, but there's also a need to almost force or encourage them to work together enough where there's some of the economies of scales and you're all buying the same software and allowing the consistency across. But that implementation is tremendously important. You know, you can put a great plan together. I always tell people I'd rather have a mediocre plan really well implemented than a fantastic plan poorly implemented. And what scares me right now is we're in the implementation stage, and I am thrilled that we've picked 3 good ones so far, that the state has picked 3 good ones. At some point, there's going to be a mistake within the SSCCs, and the thing that I think is nice about having the individual regions is if you have a problem, the state will step in. Too many times, if we're having a problem in the state, we basically, we just let it continue. If we have a problem with one of the providers, we will change. We have shown that whether it's the way we handle charter schools different than public schools, we will step in and do something with a third party that is not doing their job, whereas many times as a state, we just complain about it and don't do anything. So I'm thrilled that we're 3 for 3 so far, and I hope we end up 5 for 5, 6 for 6, but at some point there's going to be a mistake, but there's also a self-correcting mechanism that we will get it fixed. So.
Great. Other challenges and opportunities?
Other challenges, I'll just piggyback on what was been said earlier, is every community needs to be looked at separately. And as we roll out community-based care, we need to look at the resources that will be allocated. So for example, for Bexar County, we are considered a resource-rich community, but I still had to raise $7.28 million to ensure that I had the resources necessary to create the type of system that we want to create. So take some of those dollars and reinvest back into the network to help fill the gaps wherever we don't have the services that we need for children. And when we look at the different catchment areas, we recognize that there are some areas that will not have the ability to raise millions of dollars because the philanthropic community just isn't out there. And so we'll need to look at ways where we can balance that so that those communities have the opportunity to benefit from community-based care. And that may be that we have to allocate resources at the front end to those communities differently than what we've been doing.
I think the challenges and opportunities are endless. I mean, we could spend all day talking about them. I think what I would say is, so child welfare has always been dynamic, and the pendulum swings back and forth, and the sand shift, and a number of other metaphors. But we've got Families First Act. We've got a lawsuit hanging over us that's been hanging over us for many, many years. We have instability. Finally, I think we have clear direction, and community-based care, in my mind, is the answer to some of these things. It is, so I think what I worry about is too much of an overreaction one way or another, over-calibration if there's a problem where we lose our course, and that creates more instability in the system. Funding, this is not a cheaper way of serving. It is not. And so we've got to continue to invest in this and make sure that the legislature sees the return on their investment, but it is not a cheaper way of doing business. But I think what I hope is you see more. You see more for the state's investment. And then I think it's a little unnerving to think about you take a giant centralized system and you localize it, which means that for those of us that work at a statewide level, that's uncomfortable. We don't have a direct line of sight necessarily into the day-to-day of what's happening like we would if it were a big centralized system. So there has to be, I have to resist the urge, and my colleagues that work at a statewide level probably have to resist the urge to overlay a lot of like prescriptive stuff because we're nervous, because we don't know what's happening, and we have to trust and have faith that this is the direction and it's going to work, but be able to identify where it's not and then adjust course as necessary.
And if I can just add one piece to that,
Yeah.
within the systems, within the communities themselves, communication is so key. Back when I was a CPS caseworker, I took, and my caseload was kids who had been removed and were now, the state was taking care of them and hopefully returning them. The investigators were right down the hall, and I could go talk to them and say, why was this kid removed? What did you see? What was going on here? By moving those systems to have a state system and a private system, we have to keep those lines of communication open. And an investigator can't just say, well, you know what, I'm going to remove this kid because it looks iffy and we'll let them take care of it. They really have to understand what the implications of removing a child are, why we're taking that kid out of the home, because we don't want to see removals go up. We don't want to see our investigators just look at it from the attitude of they'll take care of it, not us. So we really have to make sure that within the communities themselves, the communication between the state and our SSCCs, single source community contractors, are really together.
Yeah, so just to clarify for those of y'all who don't understand, the investigative side is staying the way it is. It's only once you remove the child and then move into the custodial side, that's the part that is becoming more community-based. So when you're talking about communication, that's why. So it's the back half, if you will, of CPS that is community-based, not the investigative side. Y'all already knew that, but
I agree completely. I think the whole system, we like to talk about the system, is public and private, and both have to be successful. Both have to be well-functioning and high-performing, and they both have to be communicating and talking. And I see it all the time at the local level and at the state level too, but I think we just need to make sure both the public and the private system are clear on what their roles are, and that there's support and investment in both to make sure the system is high-functioning.
Katie, you had mentioned the Family First Prevention Services Act. This was federal legislation that was recently passed that allocates Title IV-E funding and allows that funding that comes from the feds to the states to be used for preventative services and child welfare, as opposed to just the reactive services after the child is removed. So allowing states more flexibility in how they can use federal dollars to actually prevent kids from going into care. I also mentioned the ongoing lawsuit, MD v. Abbott, that's about our child welfare system. I'm going to ask you all to look into your crystal balls a little bit. How do you think these two issues may affect community-based care moving forward? Crystal ball time.
So, crystal ball. In the short term, I think it's going to be painful. When you look at Family First Act and what it is asking us to do or telling us to do now that it's law. When you look at Texas in terms of child welfare, we rely heavily on residential care in our foster care system. And with Family First Act, it's telling us to move away from that. It's telling us that if you are a residential facility, you need to become a quality residential treatment program, QRTP. You have to become nationally accredited, and there are many organizations that are not nationally accredited. They're providing great services, but they're not nationally accredited. And we've got this 2 or 3 year window now before all of this takes effect in Texas. And so my concern, I think our pain point will be, will we be able to grow enough capacity in our foster home across the state before we start seeing some of the reductions in residential care? Or will our providers decide they can't afford to move to become a nationally accredited organization or become a quality residential treatment program, because all of that does take resources, and will they decide to go in a different direction than taking away that capacity for children that are currently in care? And so I think there will be a pain point there in the beginning, but in the long run, at the end of the day, we want children with families. We want children to be with their families, and so I think the prevention dollars are well spent, and I think if that's something that our legislature can look at this session, is to increase those prevention dollars so that we can strengthen our families and keep children in their families with the right safety net, the right wraparound services. So long term, I think it's a great benefit. That's the way we should be moving and we should be going, but my immediate concern will be with capacity in the children that are currently in care.
I think the purpose of Family First is a great one, which is to keep the child from being removed. That's what it should be. The way it is set up, it's kind of funny. I think you said something about the federal government trying to provide flexibility to the states, and I'm just laughing because that's the whole problem with it, and the reason DFPS or CPS has decided to push its implementation, because there's nothing in it that's flexible. It doesn't recognize the differences between Texas and Hawaii. You know, that it makes it extremely difficult, and it really wastes the dollars that should be going to children on the government bureaucracy between the feds and the state. At the same time, I love the idea of Families First, which is we need to prevent children from leaving the home. It's incredibly expensive and damaging, traumatizing on the child to remove them unless you absolutely have to. You know, 20% of these cases are because of abuse, 80% are neglect. 80% of those are not the cases that you think about. They're neglect. The child's not being taken care of the way you want. So eventually we just say, this is so bad, we're going to remove them. Then when we remove the child, we hold them hostage until the family fixes itself, or we hold them hostage, and then eventually we remove them. So the average child stays in foster care for 21 months in the state. When you consider the age of the child, it's a huge percentage of their life. One of the things I'm hoping that we can do, whether it's Family First or with the state programs, is shorten that time. Don't remove them until you have to. When you remove them, in an ideal world, once you remove them, to me, you should be trying to move on to permanence somewhere else.
Well, and I appreciate that perspective on it. I would say I think that as scary as community care was to me, maybe Family First Act is to you, and maybe there's a way we can pull you towards understanding what it can ultimately do, which is I think at the end of the day, you said it very well. It's taking better care of our kids when we have them in care and keeping them out in the first place. And I think that tertiary prevention is so key. I also think it aligns with our federal law, with the lawsuit, that we have here in Texas, which really says our kids who age out of care do not go on to success, and that is a huge, huge red flag on the state. There was a colleague of mine who works in homeless services, and she says when she talks to homeless youth on the street, homeless youth who ended up there on their own versus those who came from the CPS system, the homeless youth who ended up on their own invariably do better off than the CPS kids. They've learned how to survive better, they've learned how to get resources better, they've learned how to do things better, because our system just did not allow them to grow and support and develop the tools that they needed to find their own resources. And that, to me, is just such a huge... I mean, I can think of no worse way to describe our system than it actually puts kids worse off than better off. And so to really align with Representative Frank, we then need to keep kids out of that system and only make sure it's there for the most high needs, for those where the families really have such major crises that we cannot ultimately fix that. And then to go on to that last piece about permanency, I think one of the problems right now with our CPS system is we look at things from a situational permanency standpoint. We say, you were in abuse, we're going to pick you up out of the abusive situation, put you somewhere else, it's no more abuse, you're saved. Situational permanency. And we have to think about relational permanency, which is who are those kids connected to? Do they have their relationships with family members and mentors and churches and others where they can really support them? Are we building new relationships like that? And so that's what I really hope we do with this system, is build relationship connections, and I hope Family First can do that.
And that's the key question in my mind with Family First is, will it allow the innovation that we've been talking about that's happening with community-based care to to continue. You mentioned the residential treatment centers. I was talking to another one of the SSCCs who is actually experimenting with getting rid of residential treatment centers by training up family foster homes to provide that same level of service, but in that family setting. It's a brilliant model, and I think there's a movie to come out of one of these families because the mom is a former professional wrestler, and they're just dedicated.
You actually need that with some.
You really do.
Actually, it's not a bad.
But they've just dedicated their entire lives to taking care of this child who was formerly in a highly intensive residential treatment center, and now this child is in a family setting getting the same level of treatment. And that's the kind of innovation that CBC allows for that we need to make sure that we're protecting and continuing.
Well, I think the lack of flexibility is what stops the innovation. You know, when you think about it, if you stop a child from going in foster care, the average foster kid costs about $2,500 a month. If you left them in their home, imagine the services you could provide for that. But we don't. We do them in separate silos, so you can't use the money of stopping a kid from being in foster care. You can't use them for services. So what you end up doing is have this mishmash of programs that don't all work the same, and so we just keep putting more and more and more money in, but we're not necessarily getting better results. And that's the cycle that hopefully we're fixing a little bit with community-based care, and hopefully we can work with, maybe we can work with families first in a way that actually allows us to not just create another program that doesn't impact kids.
I haven't encountered an organization. I work with hundreds of nonprofits and community organizations across the state, and I haven't heard of anybody that doesn't believe in the goals of Families First Act. And in fact, I think when that act passed, we were all like, this is super cool because Texas is already there. Senate Bill 11 has many of the same intention and goals as the Families First Act that we've already passed and said we want kids at home and we want them in least restrictive settings, we want effective services and all that. I think the bureaucrat in me is a little bit afraid of...
Former bureaucrat.
Thank you. Former bureaucrat.
Reformed bureaucrat.
I've got love for my bureaucratic friends, but I think no one disagrees with Families First goals and intentions and all the good stuff you've heard today. I think for me, what it boils down to is the prescriptive. It's interesting. This act is both completely ambiguous and incredibly prescriptive at the same time. And so the prescriptive aspects of the bill are going to have a huge price tag. I mean, and it's stuff like IT changes and reporting, and it's incredibly expensive to implement or not. And I guess I regret that the state is in a position where we have to make a tough decision, likely based on financing it, and because that is funding that I wish could go directly to programs and services for kids and families. So.
Before we open it up for Q&A, just very quickly, outside of community-based care, what issues should the legislature be considering this session to improve the way that we care for kids and families? And this is for everybody.
I'll start since I think one, with all the emphasis, frankly, with the new investigators and that kind of stuff, I think sometimes, we talk about balancing. I think there are times where we're removing children that we don't need to. If you look, I'm going to give you one example just in our area. Wichita Falls and Abilene, roughly the same size communities, 104,000 in one, 118,000 in the other. There are twice as many children, over twice as many children removed in Abilene than there are in Wichita Falls. Well, I'm not going to say that publicly at this point. It should be the same regardless of where you live. The standards of removal should be the same regardless of where you live. You shouldn't find yourself, I'm in a city that removes quickly, or I'm in a city that, for instance, opens up a CPS investigation if a parent gets caught with marijuana. Because once you start an investigation, the likelihood of removal just goes through the roof with no impact on the child, but the parent does something. At some point we're going to have a situation where anybody that calls a suicide hotline is going to have somebody pop in and take your child. Is that really where we need to be? Because your child's at risk. We've got to be more careful without overreacting, without criticizing CPS. These are the rules that CPS and the judges live by. They're all the same, but they are implemented vastly different across the state, and I think we've got to be more consistent on that part of it. The other thing I hope and pray that we do is leave CPS alone from a trauma standpoint. You're talking about creating trauma, that we don't make a bunch of changes, not big changes, but I think we can keep making some small changes. And the last thing I'll say is I think one thing we got to stop doing is calling CPS a broken system. It's not a broken system. It doesn't always work great. The culture may be broken. Families may be broken. CPS works very well in many places. In some places it doesn't. You've got a lot of very hardworking people, and the places where it doesn't work, whether the CPS worker, whether the judge is not paying attention, that's bad, and we need to fix that. But it is not a broken system. We need to improve it. We need to improve it. We need to improve it.
So I have three things. One would be to continue community-based care in all of its stages and let it roll out, let it play out. I think we've got some great momentum going with the three that we've got going now, and I think we can see continued momentum and great successes if we allow it to roll out the way it was stated in Senate Bill 11. And so I'd like to see continued support of community-based care. I'd also like to see continued support of prevention. We want to keep children out of the system. If we can keep them with their families, as Representative Frank said, it's most cost-effective to keep a child with their family. And when you look at the statistics of how they do much better in school, they do much better in life if they receive the resources that they needed to be able to keep them together. And then third would be we need foster homes. We need to build our foster home capacity across the state. And so I think we need to look at how are we supporting our organizations that are providing services to foster families so that we can continue to encourage growth and capacity as we move forward.
I think for me, and I'm asked all the time, what's the number one issue with the system in your mind? And I'd say the number one issue with the system is that it's a system. And it is, so I think for me, it's about, making sure every child or family, regardless of the stage of intervention they may be in, way upstream, midstream, downstream, that they have the right services that are effective and swift to get them in and out and get back on with their lives. And so, all this conversation about foster care or prevention, all of it, it's all important, it's all needed, and we just have to raise the bar across to make sure there's a full continuum of effective services to meet the needs of every child and family in this state. So no problem. If you could just make that happen, that'd be great. Yeah.
And I would just add the last piece. I think those are all wonderful and very important, but let's get back to the kids in care. Let's get back to who this system is all about. And our kids who age out of care do not do well. Their rates of teen pregnancy, their rates of incarceration, of substance abuse are so much higher than their peers. We have to support these kids with resources and dollars. And we have to make sure that our universities are authorized as placement so that kids who do use that tuition benefits to go to college are able to find a place to stay. We have to get more workforce training for these kids. We have to revitalize the training we give them while they're in care. We have to set up opportunities and bridges for these kids to go on and be successful adults. And so I really hope that the legislature is able to work on that population. They've done amazing work. They put so much dollars and so much time and resources into the system. But those kids who age out of care is an area that I think has just been a little bit less supported. And it's not as a detriment to them. It's a hard area. Teenagers in general are hard. Kids in care are hard. Kids who've grown up in care are hard. So it's not an easy answer, but I do think it's somewhere that I hope we get attention put on.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking our panel. Want to open it up for questions. If you have a question, just raise your hand and there'll be a microphone coming through the room. Right over here.
Thank you. I have a really good family, we had a really good family court judge that expressed to me a concern that we don't look at abused children in a holistic way, because there are some cases where not both parents are abusive, but one is an abused spouse with abused children, and the terminations seem to be cut and pasted, that if you end the termination for one parent, then you do both. And you're not looking at the fact that that abused parent and those children have formed a very tight bond, and I would suggest they need to heal together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a great point, and it seems like you've been hanging around the TPPF offices for some of our conversations. But that individualized determination on each parent is important. Treating the parent as an individual, because like you said, there are situations where one of the spouse is abusing the children, is also abusing that other spouse. The other spouse is a victim and should not be punished. And having an individualized determination by the court and requiring that to happen is a way to protect that right of the non-offending parent. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think you will find legislation to that end filed this session, if that matters. So yeah.
I think it does. In CPS, there's a stereotype of the bad boyfriend, the guy who doesn't really know the kids and is physically abusive and whatnot, and it's very understandable. But in many cases, that mom is out there working a job or two, and she has the option of, do I leave my kid alone or do I leave him with this person? And in many ways, she's made the more protective choice. She left it with an adult to watch the kids. But then when something bad happens, you see the result there. So we're very excited to see legislation in that area.
Great. Other questions? We have in the back here and then in the middle there.
This question is for Ms. Rodriguez. You talked about Bexar County. They're taking a lot of children out of Bexar County and putting them in foster homes because they don't have enough people accepting them in. Is there any work that you're doing with the churches? Because in Bexar County, there's like 1,900 churches, and you divide that by 2, and that pretty much solves the problem.
Yes, there is a group called the Texas Alliance for Orphans, run by Jennifer Smith, and she has brought together a group of churches, over 30 churches. So we have started work with her. We had several workshops with the faith-based community, so we're going to be starting some initiatives. And this spring, we're going to do a targeted foster family recruitment campaign for the entire network for Family Tapestry in Bexar County. And we're going to be reaching out to very specific populations, and the faith-based community is going to be one of those. But as to the group the children that are being sent out of Bexar County, a lot of those kiddos are going to Houston and/or to other areas of the state that have residential treatment centers. So we're talking about adolescents with higher emotional and behavioral needs. So which means what we need in Bexar County are more therapeutic foster families that are willing and able and skilled to be able to work with those children.
And I would just add that beyond Bexar County, the faith-based community has really stepped up, and First Lady Abbott has a whole initiative, the Network of Nurture, around encouraging the faith community and the child welfare community to come together and really partner. So it's very cool.
And really, we need to drop, in my opinion, we need to drop the unreasonable barriers that we create on foster homes. As a former foster parent, we've adopted them, but when you're counting socks on a quarterly basis, that's the one I use literally to turn in a report. It's a little silly when you go for 60 hours of training, maybe then need to go to 100 hours of training. It's like, I'm sorry, if you need more than 35, 40 hours of training, you may not be getting the right foster parent, right? Anyway, so there's some things that we do to artificially set up barriers. I mean, I think it's critically important that we get great foster parents. It's just, what barriers do we put up? Do we put up intelligent barriers, or do we just put up barriers?
That's a great point. I think we had in the back here.
Hi, good morning. My name's Larissa. I'm with Congressman Michael McCall, and my boss has been a leader in combating child trafficking. And we've noticed, obviously, that children who are in the child welfare system are very susceptible to human trafficking. And I was just interested in hearing your observations on that, if you've, the trends that you've seen, or if you've seen an improvement with advances that we've made in the last couple years. But just to get your thoughts on the impacts of human trafficking on the children coming or who are in the system.
Sure. Well, from a statewide, absolutely. I mean, this is something I think Texas has really stepped up to the plate. We are a leader, I think, in the country on recognizing this very vulnerable population. And I think for youth in the foster care system, they're at higher risk for many things, including trafficking. And so the governor's office has been a real leader in the Department of Family and Protective Services. They've been clear with the direction. They want services for these youth, and they've even funded services all over the state, and they continue to do that. And I know that in Bexar County you have some services for youth. So I think we have a long way to go still to be able to really say that we've got enough services to meet all the needs, but I think we're on our way.
I think this is an instance where the kid who's most likely to be trafficked is the kid who's on runaway. And so what we have to do is support our system so that our kids aren't leaving. And kids who run away from care, they go 2 places. They go back looking for their parents, or they go often boyfriend or girlfriend, which is just a surrogate family. So kids running away from care are looking for a family, and that's where they come at such risk. We have to then support the ability for our system to operate more like a family meaning, pardon me, more treatment, foster care, more residential, less kids in care in general, all of those pieces. But we really have to support these kids before they are at that risk stage.
Yeah. And I would just, go ahead.
Oh, you mentioned in your closing about the number of kids aging out of foster care, because I think those are highly susceptible to trafficking. I think one of the things, we can set up systems and should set up systems to make sure that those kids are taken care of, but a kid's not truly going to be safe until they have an adult that has responsibility for them. A system is not going to be set up that is good enough for an 18-year-old to make it on their own without being able to call somebody and say, hey, what classes should I sign up for? What trade school should I go to? What job should I take? We cannot have kids aging out, but it's not aging out of a system. They need to, if we're going to take them out of a place of permanence, we need to get them to a place of permanence, and that involves individuals.
Okay, we've got questions here and then down front.
And if we could get that block grant from Congressman McCall, we would love you. Love you, love you, love you. Thank you very much.
Session is in full swing.
What's that?
Session's in full swing.
I mean, come on. I can't pass up that opportunity.
Please.
Okay, this is for anyone on the panel. I'm just curious how you see the community-based care model helping to decrease disproportionality rates we see across the system with the children.
I think, having just gone through the RFA and having those discussions with the state is very mindful of disproportionality and are having conversations with us. So as we're looking at and working with the department, that is data that we're going to be collecting and also be looking at and analyzing. We don't have a solution today, but we know that it's an issue that needs to be addressed. We recognize it, and we have committed with DFPS and ourselves that we will continue the dialogue and find a solution as we move forward. So I don't have a solution, but just know that it's definitely on the radar. And now that we're going to have data to collect, we'll be able to hopefully start making progress in that area.
And I think our goal in all of that should be to have our workers and our systems as colorblind as possible. Not necessarily counting how many of these do you have, but it should be as colorblind as possible. Abuse in one home is just the same. It's not against the law to be poor. It's not against the law to live differently. But the worker needs to be colorblind, and the consequences need to be colorblind, no matter where you are, and no matter what part of the state you're in.
Disproportionality is an issue in many stages of service, but in the investigative side, which community-based care doesn't touch necessarily, African American children that are removed at a higher rate or disproportionately higher rate. But also they stay in care longer. And I think that stay in care longer is where I think community-based care can really help to move the needle in the right direction there. But community-based care is only for kids in foster care at this point. That family preservation stage of service, I think, is an opportunity that the state has to continue to make some real headway in that regard.
Well, and I would say though, through community-based care, we can recruit families of color as foster homes, and we can really look at what the culture of the kids we have in care and try to go after that specifically. I think one of the things I love so much about the placement system that we have in community-based care is not only do you get a model of what types of kids you have, but then you can then go recruit based on that model, and you can work on that. So maybe there's a way to really look at what the data is and start supporting that data at the same time we try to decrease it and really work on some of those things that have been brought up.
We had one down front here. Good.
From the foster family, the mother and father abandoned the child at a very young age, was with his foster family, knew no other family, when the parents decided they wanted the child back several years later. And they won the case, and the child went with total strangers. And I remember the attorney that was representing the parents, the birth parents, saying, gee, she will get over it, won't she? And I wanted to say, no, it will disturb her for the rest of her life. I know that. And it was so wrong where, as far as this child was concerned, these foster parents were her parents. And you could even see the parents getting very irritated at the child carrying on about going home when the child didn't even know these people? Does it still happen?
I think your question illustrates just how difficult of a problem we're facing, and that the system faces, that the court faces. Some of these choices, some of these decisions that have to be made are really very challenging decisions. And the hard part about that is what's hanging in the balance is what is good for a child, what's going to help this child be stable, be happy and experience that love of a family that they deserve to be experiencing.
I think one thing it does point out, this is a social services issue, but it's also very much a legal issue. Mm-hmm. What are the, and really in that case, whoever that foster family, it's a legal issue. The parent has the child until legally we say they don't. Okay, and so that's one of those where you go, somebody needed to advise them differently to go ahead and get that process started. And it's a shame, but at the end of the day, we elect judges that make those decisions, and you know what? Sometimes I don't agree with the judges. You know what I mean? But that's where when you have good judges, things work much better. When you have good CPS workers, things work much better. When you have bad ones, we need to get rid of them, whether it's judges, CPS workers, or legislators.
And to your point
You
earlier,
didn't need to clap on the legislator. You could have clapped on either of the first two. No, you waited.
and to your point earlier, Representative Frank, that's why we need good standards.
That's
and
right.
Clear
Yeah.
standards.
Yes.
Okay.
I think the shame about this is I know nothing about this case, but my suspicion is that the mom also experienced great trauma that was probably unaddressed. In my prior role at the department, I staffed many, many cases of child abuse and neglect, and what I saw was you go just a few years back, and it's the perpetrator, the parent, that also had abuse or neglect in their lives that might not have been addressed by the system. So that's the shame. And so if we could sort of reimagine foster care to be more of a support, not just to the child, but to the family as well, we might avoid situations like that.
And that's what I wanted to add, just in terms of practice. Children's Shelter is a CPA, and in working with our foster families, we highly encourage them to become mentors to the bio family. A large part of these children will go back to their families, and we've got a foster family now who co-parents with the biological parent, and so that foster parent is able to stay in that child's life, and that connection is there, and she celebrates birthdays with them and celebrates other milestones in their lives. But that's also a difficult ask to do of foster parents, and I know it's not something that's widespread, but I do believe it's a best practice that we should continue to move towards to help alleviate that separation of a child who's only known these two individuals as their parents. Yeah.
We have time for one or two more. In the middle there, and then right here up front.
Thank you. I'd really like to kind of second what Representative Frank said. We just had a foster child go back last month, which is great. We will likely never foster again. And as we talk about in San Antonio, this issue in all of these churches, there's going to be a year lead time because it takes about a year for most foster parents to go through the whole process. And every year, they have to go through the vast majority of that same process. And so for us to be able to recruit new foster homes and new foster families, the bar has got to be lowered. Because I don't need to learn every year how to restrain a baby. I don't need to count every sock that I buy a child. There's so many areas of red tape that we have got to get rid of. And so I hate to duplicate what you've already said, but it's such an important point that for us to say that we're doing a great thing by going out and trying to recruit foster families, you're losing foster families because we can't continue to commit the time year after year after year to go back and be retrained on the stupid things.
Well, the one thing I would thank you for your point. Obviously, I agree with it. The one thing I would say when you're talking about it is, I don't think we're lowering the bar. We're not lowering the bar by getting rid of stupid standards, right? We are actually raising the quality of people that we get. We get people that are there for the right reasons. When you put all these artificial bars and lengthy trainings and all of these things in place, what you do is make it where only the people that are doing it for the money are willing to put up with it. Okay? And so we need people that are there for the child, not for the check. And the way to do that is to make intelligent, reasonable training requirements, intelligent, reasonable documentation requirements. You should not spend more time documenting what you're doing with the child than the amount of time you're spending with the child. Okay? You are already bringing somebody who has challenges into your home, disrupting your home, and then you add to that the oversight and compliance and documentation processes where you're spending hours and hours every week writing and documenting things. That is simply, we've got to find a way where we're not doing that because
Last question very quickly right here up front.
My comment before that foster family in my community, they feel they spend hours documenting, and their reports are seen by no one except perhaps the CPS worker, but they're not seen by the judge, not seen by anyone who is involved in the decision making, and yet they spend the most amount of time with the child, and so they're very frustrated. And so if we can't how do we support the foster families so that we can improve, increase the numbers, et cetera?
if only we had an SSCC here
That's right.
that would have some flexibility. Hopefully that the state will allow them enough flexibility to screen foster parents for what you need to and not require them to do some of the things that they don't need to.
I will say our system has changed a little bit. I know maybe it's not the answer you're looking for, and maybe a different answer, but it used to be foster families really were foster families, and they supported kids and worked with kids when they came into care, and then hopefully those kids went home and they went to other places. So many of our foster families come in the system now with the idea that they may be adopting kids, and they come in looking for kids. And I'm not saying that's wrong, but we need to really think about that. Because foster families go, well, I was told that this kid would be able to stay, and they couldn't, and whatnot. We need to be 100% honest with everyone and say, what's your role in supporting kids when they're here? I completely agree that the foster families and parents need to have a stronger connection. Safety is a huge issue. I'm not necessarily saying we don't do it in a way that doesn't support them, but if a foster family is able to work with a kid and able to help that kid excel and develop, and then none of that information is translating to the parent when they go home, all of that is lost, like you said. So I really do think that we need to think more about what are our foster parents' roles, what do they do, how do we support them in that roles, training and otherwise, but also where the kid is going and what's going to happen.
Communicating that to them more clearly, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And through community-based care, we will be able to have the foster family's voice heard much more loudly and much more frequently than I think that we have been accustomed to in the past, because they will be part of the teams that help create the service plans for the children, and as determinations are made and decisions are made on service planning and permanency, the foster family will play a critical role in that as well.
It sounds like many of you all are involved or have been involved. I hope that you will continue to be involved in your community to help solve this problem. Thank you so much for joining us. If you would like to participate in a TPPF video about policy orientation and what you learned at this panel, please go to meeting room 412 after we break. And the next panel in this room will be TRS-SOS, Solving the Teacher Retirement System Crisis. That'll start at 11 a.m. Thank you so much and enjoy your day.